I was isolated. I was left alone. No food, no water.
She was isolated both times she was in the hospital, right?
Yes, ma'am. Nobody could get in to see her at any point in time.
I wasn't expecting that. I wasn't expecting that because if somebody's very critical, shouldn't I have known this? Isn't this something that you tell a family member? You've got this person in isolation. We can't see him and he's very critical and I don't even know. I thought he was going to go in and get oxygen for a few days and medication. I had no reason to suspect he was very critical. And again, the only reason I knew about the code blue was through records. I've learned so much through his records.
She felt like it was okay. And I wish I never left her there alone, because after I left her there, that's when they had her sign the NDR.
She could have been there. And my sister wouldn't have had to die alone.
His kid was raw when I finally got to see him.
Oh.
It was hard to touch because it was so tough. And so, on the end of the 10th day, I got to see him, touch him, but the nurse wouldn't leave me alone with him. She kept talking and talking and talking.
I was heartbroken. I felt like I left him in prison.
He showed us with his, that his hands were tied up. He said that most of the time he was alone, and that there was barely anybody there to attend to him.
I just think, I grew up knowing that you always need a family member to advocate for you, especially when you can't advocate for yourself when you're not well. And they didn't allow that. They took that away from us. They took that whole ability to be there and hold their hand and to say it's going to be okay. I think the isolation alone makes people sick. It kills people as well. And so that makes me very angry.
I mean, she was stuck in that place by herself, had never been alone in her life without her family. And, so she's in this hospital bed where they were short-staffed. It took 9 days, and me and my sister-in-law reaming the nurses before she got her first shower. She messaged me begging me, because she felt so disgusting. She was so dirty that, we pretty much lit up the nurses, and a sweet little nurse that she had did it herself and, gave her her first shower after 9 days.
They had never brushed her hair, ever.
Nope.
Or not even the day she died, it was a rat's nest. And there was blood all over the floor from her nose bleeding and them not cleaning it up.
Them being so alone, of course they're going to probably want to give up, because no one's there.
But she suffered along, went to the hospital to get better, and then just continued to suffer along until finally she passed away.
But the main thing is that she died alone. She died probably terrified with nobody there. Mm-hmm. And her biggest fear in life, and I have a video of it before she passed a year earlier, that if they take her away in the hospital, they're going to lock her up and throw away the key.
Broke my heart that so many of them died with nobody, and probably feeling completely abandoned. It's just so wrong.
It is.
So I feel very blessed that God gave us that time with her, because we did get to have conversations, and we got to be with her, we got to hold her hands. But it really, when I say it was a silent Holocaust, because these people, they were alone. They were alone. They did not have their families with them, and they're being murdered silently, and no one's talking about it.
Was he allowed to have family there? He was isolated?
Not allowed to have family. They just let us do the FaceTime. But he couldn't even talk. I couldn't hear him.
I think they were just trying to keep us, because as I talked to him, they wanted to isolate my husband and confuse him and keep him hammering in everything that they were telling him. Just never had a chance.
Still, I've asked 100 times, can I see him? No, he's still testing positive. He's isolated.
And I went into ICU and they were not going to let me in the room with him. And I just walked into the isolation.
But anyway, we couldn't see her. They isolated her for 20 days. So the family was kept from her. I was kept from her. My girls were kept from her.
I don't even think they gave him water at all. And I just, it goes in my mind thinking that they did not give him water, like his mouth was dry, his organs were shut. They probably didn't feed him. They wouldn't let us talk to him. We couldn't see him. There was no visits. They totally isolated. And this man is a very social man. He loves his family. He loves being around people. It really helps him. And they totally isolated him like a prisoner and gave him this experimental medication.
But at that time, no. So I was given brief reports, different doctors. She was completely isolated. We were not given any visitation.
They had forgotten to tell me during that time period, since I couldn't visit, they were allowing Zoom calls, but nobody told me about that until really about the time that they wanted to refer me to palliative care.
Isolation means you are cut off from contact from the outside world.
They wouldn't let my husband come in with me. They told him, go out to the car, go home. He wasn't allowed in the waiting room, nothing. He sat out in the car, and he told me he cried because he had absolutely no idea what to do and felt so helpless.
They label me combative because I ask questions about her care. That means they can isolate me. There's no advocate for her.
I mean, I think he had already, this was almost a week into him being in, the COVID unit, isolated. We're not allowed to see him.
So we tried to get him out of that hospital, but the doctors had to sign off on him leaving the hospital, and they refused to do it. So, we would have paid for transport, but they wouldn't let him. He said, the doctors had to do that, and they would not agree to that. So basically, he was a prisoner there in that hospital.
And she was isolated out of, it was one per person room. So she was always, like I said, she was outgoing. She wasn't one of those people that she would actually get drained of energy if she was isolated out. She was very going, so she always needed that interaction with people, and I'm sure that beat her down.
I know that we weren't allowed to go see her. She was in isolation.
I told her that when they did that, they would isolate her from her family.
Nobody was allowed to be there with her or whatever. So she was there by herself, and I had called her phone. It was on voicemail. I had texted her quite a few times. I told her, to please call me because I needed to know what was going on with her. I knew she was there by herself.
I wish I would have went in there and just said, you know what, get the police. I'm not leaving. I'm sick sitting by her side. And that's the thing too. I'll sign any waiver. I would have signed any waiver to say, well, if you get COVID, you can't hold us responsible. Fine. I'm like, because I never contracted it. They didn't, even care, like just to be with her and so that she wasn't alone while she was going through this.
And so of course he's gonna listen to them. He was alone. He was isolated. They didn't feed him. They didn't put a feeding tube in him till 4 days later. He didn't eat, at all when he was in the emergency for the 2 days.
And my mama was so scared. So scared. She never had anxiety or panic attacks or anything. But when she fell that day, it changed. And she had to deal with anxiety and stuff. And I can only think about the times that she was scared and probably didn't get her medicine or other things. We just weren't allowed to see her. And it just wasn't fair at all.